extended present, where the past will become the future, and so you're constantly thinking, oh, I will do this thing in the future, and or I will do something now, and then will become something that I can experience in the future. And I really love that idea of this extended presence and the sort of playfulness that it invites. So, so you know, setting it up and paying homage to Graham's work, but really exploring how our body reacts to the physical manifestation of this data we feed it.
Amazing. Amazing demonstration of so many concepts, philosophically and otherwise. We, in VRTO 2016, we had Steve Mann come and talk about feedback delayed is feedback denied. And this sort of idea of surveillance. You have surveillance and then you have surveillance, which is, do I get to look back at myself being looked at? And I remember early on we sort of talked about this whole notion of like the security camera and the displacement of the self, and which is, what's the ownership of that. And I also think of when I was younger, I thought, why would I do something good? Like, why should I behave or eat broccoli or, you know, save up money? It doesn't make any sense. Like, life is for living. And then I kind of got into this idea of, well, what I'm doing is I'm being kind to my future self. So what I do now might be delayed, but there will be a moment at which a version of me shows up and says, dude, thanks so much for doing that in the past. And I love that there's this short time loop where you can kind of experiment with this idea of like 16 seconds from now, I'm gonna look back on what I just did and ask myself if that was a good choice or a cool choice or a bad choice. And I think that's extraordinarily powerful because of the way time is so relative, and it collapses and it expands, and how memory does the same thing. So to spatialize that is profound, I think.
Yeah, I think that with this emerging technology, you know, the very foundation of VR is this positional information we give it. We simply can't have VR unless we are tracking the position of the head and controllers if we're having some sort of interactivity, right? We just can't. It doesn't work. And so we naturally, you know, we put on the VR headset and we're in these systems, and, you know, we're not really thinking about the fact that it's taking this information, right? Mm-hmm. And so given these concerns that we might have about how much information we're feeding into the system, I think it's one thing to talk about, oh yeah, we're tracking your position in time and space. It's another thing to be confronted by it, right? To see it in this body and to feel it with your own body, what it's like to come face to face with it. I think it's one of the really interesting things that I learned in those early experiments was just how little data you need to give it to create something that is very clearly lifelike, that is very clearly somebody. And everyone who's gone through this, you know, I had a 10-year-old kid in yesterday, and his mom was watching it, and she was saying, that's so him. Like, she could tell from his gait and the way that he was moving these avatars that you know, and this technology is being used by governments, right? Like, this is not, you know, sci-fi stuff. We can identify people from just the movement data. So I mean, so I think that this work, in a sense, is hinting at, you know, let's just at the very least understand, shed light on, you know, we talk about Steve Mann and surveillance. Let's shed light on the information we're giving into these systems, right?
San Francisco banned facial recognition algorithms, and Philip Rosedale, who created Second Life and High Fidelity, also pointed out at a talk he did for us a few years ago that you can be identified through your VR head movement, as you just pointed out, and that's like forensic. And so you think you're hiding anonymously behind your Kermit the Frog avatar, but you're not. And another piece that just came out is called MEU, M-E-U, and what they wanted to do, these are neuroscientists who wanted to explore how to do better nuanced communication with someone that you love or care about. And someone was saying to me yesterday, oh, you know, the one thing I really want from VR is to be able to communicate with my girlfriend in Australia in a meaningful way. And I wanted to tell them that what MEU figured out was that they just have particle emitters. They're these very simple, it creates little flower patterns or sparkles or whatever. But what, and you can record a short loop to send to your SO. And the movement of the particle emitters that's being traced is what is the tell. Ah, that's my girlfriend, because of that little lilt of her head or the movement of the hand or the wrist is the thing that's conveying the humanity in that person and that nuance. It's not necessarily the blocky. So there's so many things that we are picking up that up until now we haven't been able to sort of break down into these constituent parts. And I think that both of your works are kind of underscoring a lot of, like, as you said with the statues, that ability to see it in an embodied space, and the entire somatosensory sensorium that is pulling in, light map data, the atmospheric volume light in the room, the temperature, and all of that, and the relationship to that object. I think it roots us in the here and now, and I would also argue that the here and now is totally fake as well. So to develop the muscle, right, the mental muscle to sort of be able to separate these constituent parts will give us a better advantage as it becomes unrecognizable to us in the next 15 or 20 years. That was a rhetorical question.
Well, I'd just like to say that I do think that within our sort of embodiment or physical movement, the fact that we're grounded in these bodies, I think there's a fear sometimes when people think about VR that we're being detached from our bodies, and I would actually argue the opposite, that it roots us further in our bodies, and actually we can explore the sort of affect of our bodies in space. And that, to me, is what's really exciting about VR, is to kind of explore the creative potential in that. And I think that we share that sort of curiosity.
Just some of the things you're saying, I don't understand enough about it, but what I do find really exciting to think about is raycasting. Does your piece use raycasting? I don't know enough about this, but the medical data visualization software uses raycasting so that the computer is only rendering where your eyes are looking, and outside of that it doesn't exist. Blows my mind.
Like a light field, in a sense.
Yeah, but how it makes us think about reality generally and how we perceive. So does just this exist, or is there anything there when I'm not looking at it in the real world?
Right, so the foveation of our perception, right? I just wrote a paper about how to move with embodied media into a post-human paradigm, right? And there's a lot of philosophy around how so far we've been kind of centering meaning and existence in the human ability to perceive the thing. If I don't see it, therefore it doesn't exist. But this desk has the same sort of realism warping power as perhaps my consciousness does, is what the new school talks about, the whole post-human movement. And a thing I love about VR is the ability to demonstrate what the hell that just meant, which is if you're just in the space and you're not known to be in the space and you're a witness to that space, what does it do without you? And what does it need without you? And there's a lot of people who are into the simulation hypothesis and into quantum theory and this idea of, like, if I don't see it, it's only being rendered just in time. But what if the other argument is true? And what if our consciousness and its ability to affect anything is as neutral as a rock or a sock or something remote? What would that do to our ability to conceptualize what's really going on? Because our perceptions are so evolutionarily derived that we uniquely see color and we uniquely see shape and form. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of sound molecules and light rays, and it doesn't take on this form. That's a human evolutionary requirement, right? And so how can we use these technologies, leverage these tools to pull apart our cognitive biases And is it worth it? I mean, the question I ask is, do you even want to take the red pill? Because maybe we're good. Like, maybe it should just stay the way. So anyways, but it safely gives us a little more space to take the tether out and say, and I think the reason that matters is because it says if you can do that, then you can also probably escape your ideology. You won't get stuck in this idea, well, I am the right one because I was born here and I was this color and da da da. But maybe it just shows you how much that's all just smoke.
Yes.
Anything else? Any questions? Brett?
So both of your work is, I think, very profound.
And I've been calling for something in VR for a long time. I believe it needs ritual. And it has, you know, the putting on of the headset, as you mentioned, the ripping it off. I mean, that's not a ritual. It's actually almost, you know, brutal in a way. But what you're both doing, did you come at it from that idea of creating a kind of personal ritual into the mystery of what you're exploring? Because I think the medium needs that more than almost anything else.
Yeah, I guess as we're becoming more and more, our lives are going, the balance between the real and the virtual, whatever we want to call it, is so embedded in our lives now that we have to be more aware of the difference and how we're shifting, how we're changing. So that is just recognizing that moment of putting the VR headset in is a shift of reality, but how different is it from when we're on Facebook or on Instagram? And so this making this kind of installation gives an opportunity to really highlight it and make us aware of it, that there's that shift.
I think that awareness is what's critical, because we are going into a liminal space that is just like going into a ritual. It's going into a liminal space where certain other things apply, and yet we have to be embodied in that. So it's the only way we get to experience ourselves and the other, and you know, this is just the most fascinating area that you guys are playing with.
I remember the Instagram stars in China who put on some base makeup and then take on a filter, and they become these extremely famous, beautiful avatars. And there was one where the filter glitched out and everybody saw who the real person was, and it was just pandemonium, and the sponsors were pulling out and everything. And somehow people believed that that's how that person looked, with the giant anime eyes and the tiny mouth and the flawless, glowing, luminescent skin.
Because how they really look doesn't exist.
The ability, the expectation that is actually a thing in the real world is now almost difficult to discard.
If I may just add on the ritual thing, I do feel like rituals are important in the way that, well, traditionally they're grounded in the body. So, and for me, I think that's like I said earlier, one thing that VR has the ability to speak to very directly and powerfully. And so, you know, I wasn't necessarily thinking directly about ritual, but I was definitely thinking about how and what the body knows. And then how that might inform, you know, we're talking about perception. You know, I'm a believer that how and what the body knows informs how we then perceive the world in a very direct way. So I do think that the work that I'm very much interested in exploring is exploring that space and just asking those questions, and then perhaps pushing people to just reconsider it, because I think, you know, we exist in this world, and it's very easy to forget that we were, and especially when we're buried in our phones or behind our screens, it's easy to forget that we have these bodies that we're in, and they are at the root of everything. So I think it's important to take a step back sometimes, and ritual is one of the ways that helps us do that.
And those bodies have a memory, right? And it's interesting when you build experiences where you have new appendages, you have tentacles, you have a tail, and how quickly the mind adapts to that idea. I think there's a question, Paul in the back.
I probably spend most of my time right now in the field of embodiment, so I find like this whole work to be incredibly compelling. And what I wanted to say was that I can validate what you're saying in two different ways. One is that When you work in space proprioceptively, particularly with the eyes, and you do depth perception, that's when you most feel where you are. Your nervous system activates with a kind of a GPS, and it moves you into a positional sense of self. Where that changes is when you get into hand-eye coordination, at which point you become an actor in the space doing particular things. Both are embodiment states, they're different from each other. Within those two spatial states exists like more in one way or another. We don't know about it yet, but this is a really interesting place to be working with it, liminal space being one. So the pioneering of spatial awareness as a place where we can explore brain plasticity as well as embodiment is just wide open. And this particular field is primed to kind of bring people in on that process in a much larger way. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I have to wrap it up, but thank you to all of my guests and to all of you for coming to FIVARS, which lets us keep going. And thank you to my team and to my volunteers, because I don't have 14 tentacles. And so this is literally impossible without all of those people. And give them a little wink and a thank you when you see them. Okay, I am here with my esteemed guests, Marilene Oliver and David Hahn, both artists whom we showcased at FIVARS 2019 in Toronto at the Toronto Media Arts Centre. Marilene's piece, Deep Connection, was actually shipped to us in a couple of crates, and they were slices of an MRI that had been printed out, I guess. How did you create the sculpture?
They're actually laser cut cross sections of coroplast that then, when they stack back together again, recreate the figure.
And it was of your body, wasn't it?
Yes.
So yeah. So we received a 3D version of you taken in an MRI, various versions actually of it, so that some of them sort of had sort of data missing, and there were sort of chunks that were removed or not present. And then we were able to put on a VR headset and walk in and around and through this body floating in space.
What we wanted to do was create a 3D MRI scan data set, which also had 4D embedded in it, that you could explore in virtual reality. But in order to make the data set, it was kind of an explorative piece, and it took us 3 times to actually manage to MRI scan the complete body, which at the time was obviously like disappointing, and that was wasted time, felt like wasted time. But then actually at the end, that we had these failed data sets afforded this installation, which was made of 3 data sets, where in each, as you said, each 2 iterations it's not complete, and then there's a full one which is used for the virtual reality installation. And that allowed us to kind of create these sculptures where the physical copy of the body becomes the enabler of the virtual version, because the sensors were embedded in the chests of 2 of the sculptures, and then in the central one it became like they were the guardian of the workstation and then the holder of the headset, kind of pointing back to like a Heidegger's notion of that we are the guardians of the data, and we're also the ones that are handling it all and processing it all. To make us think back about the real and the virtual and that relationship in regards to data.
Okay, excellent. And then David's piece was in some way related, because after Dan Graham, based on the work of Dan Graham was it in the 70s or the 80s?
70s, yeah.
All the way back in
74.
the 70s, right?
Yeah.
It was an exploration of feedback and the observation of the self. And in the talk that we did, so what we're doing today is we're here a year later to sort of pick up the conversation and look back at the short panel discussion that we had at FIVARS, of only of which some was captured, which I think is actually interesting, because like Marilene's piece, the whole data set is not there. We just sort of captured the end of that talk. But in sort of wanting to revisit that, I realized that a year later, now that we're in a pandemic and everybody's isolated and bubbled, and we have all of these new words like social distancing and podding and everything else, and both of these artists are also in the education system and work at colleges and have to sort of contend with that distance and virtual presence. So I thought it would be really interesting to kind of revisit the core subjects of your work and discuss, what is the implication now that we are removed and separated and our lives are sort of virtualized. And we do have this notion of like feedback and distance and delay. And even I am present here as an avatar, and I feel in most ways like I'm present. My mouth is moving, my eyes are blinking, my head is turning, and yet I have no hands, which is fine. Some people don't have hands. However, the method for communication is kind of abstracted, and you're taking certain cues from me. But on the other hand, on the other side of this camera, I could be sort of cooking a chicken pot pie and you wouldn't know, so there's a half presence there. And then there's this kind of abstraction of being. So let's talk about that. What are your feelings now a year later?
It's interesting because I think that a lot of the conceptual foundation of the work that we exhibited last year was based on kind of thinking about how we encounter the world through our bodies. And, this is a process that we normally take for granted, I think. And using that feedback mechanism to sort of force us to re-encounter exactly how we are moving through the world, the physical world, right? So in the work, you're seeing these copies of yourself that are sort of echoes of your movement in time, and you're literally confronted with it because if you stand still, they will catch up to you, right, in time. So you're literally confronted with this information. And one thing that I think has really struck me over the past 9 months or so of this pandemic, since we've been confined to, this space, this desk, these screens, these cameras, is just how little movement how confined that world becomes. So, if one of the premises of the work is considering the way that we know the world, the kind of knowledge that we can have is built upon our bodies moving through space, then what happens when we reduce that space to, the screen, right? What happens when we confine that physical space? And I think that's a little worrisome. I think that we're starting to lose certain channels of knowledge, just like the fact that the gestural knowledge that you alluded to without having hands, these sort of little bits of information, embodied knowledge that we're no longer privy to because we can't meet face to face, because I can't stand in front of you and have a conversation and see how you're holding your body and get a sense of how far or close you are to me. I think that's really valuable information. And I think communication breaks down when we're missing that information, that knowledge. But it won't be forever. So there is hopefully a time where I think perhaps we'll gain more appreciation for that once all of this is over and we can be out and about with people again.
Thank you for that. Marilyn, you have a project that you work on or with called Dyscorpia. Is that a book? Is it a body of work?
Dyscorpia was in 2019. I curated an exhibition called Dyscorpia, and then Dyscorpia kind of being the tagline, future intersections of the body and technology. And the whole exhibition was was asking artists and creative people in literature and dance, and was very interdisciplinary, to think about the future of the body and technology. Little did we know that this would be happening, the pandemic, and then we did another version in 2020 in the summer, which is purely online, which has sort of addressed some issues of the pandemic. And I think there will be another version coming out maybe next year, which will be in this new, with everything that we've learned in this time. Yeah, I would like to answer the first question, if I may, because I think there's actually been quite, so something I never could have known. We never imagined this was going to happen, that we would be experiencing these extreme experiences. And so the narrative behind the deep connection piece was, inspired isn't the right word, but it was kind of started because when my mother was dying in the hospital, I was able to be with her. And I sort of flew from Canada to France to be with her. And I was able to be in the hospital with her for the weeks that she was dying. And at a similar time, I was also being approached by some medical healthcare companies about the future of robotics and automation in healthcare. And I think they thought I would want to be speaking positively about that. Which in many ways I would be, but it kind of, because I'd been through that experience, it made me think, what would that be like if you were dying to be accompanied by an automated thing. So the deep connection kind of sets up that experience that you are a companion for a virtual body at a very vulnerable time. And so what happens is when you hold the figure's hand, it activates the heartbeat and the lungs breathing, so you animate that body. And when you let go, then the heart stops beating and the lungs stop breathing. And so I think what's been haunting in this time is to think about that actually there are so many people that are having to die alone, and how agonizing it must be for the loved ones to not be able to be with them, and having to create, imagining people dying with their cell phone as the only company that they have. And so the deep connection was almost like a foreboding of that, or I'm not sure what, but that's what kind of, that's when you ask me that question, that's what I think about, and what kind of chills me when I think back to that piece, that I had no idea that this could actually become reality so quickly. And that, is this something we will have to create technologies for?
And the thing that occurs to me is how often we look at art and think, what is this for? What is this about? These weird projects that have, this concern with the body and MRIs or playing with a 10-second delayed version of yourself. What is this all for? And then all of a sudden you're in that paradigm, and it's sort of like a roadmap to a frame for thinking around it, and thinking, okay, I mean, I want to be able to unpack the work that you've done so that it can kind of provide a way to reconcile. David, you say that it'll all end soon, but America is now losing as many people per day as we lost in 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. We've lost more people in America than in the Second World War, Americans that were lost combined through the COVID virus. And people that are left in hospitals, and I don't want to trigger anybody or upset anybody here, but it's a fact that this is happening to hundreds of thousands of people that are in hospital with the virus, are not able to see anybody. They can't see their family. They may not even be given access to a phone. There was a person in the VR community recently who was tweeting that their situation was kind of dire, and they were in the hospital, and they may not be able to tell anybody anything for the next few days, and that their friend would be taking over their account. And so we're looking at a person through a profile picture. That's all we know about them and how they look. And we're hearing about them by proxy through their friend who's tweeting at us. And the person is saying, I've made peace, and I may not be back. And And we have these abstracted relationships with these notional entities, but you're not holding the hand. It's not just about not holding the hand, it's about the fact that we could suddenly become detached from all society and suddenly be in this position. Like, I think of E.T., you know, and E.T. is put into that plastic holding cell and becomes very pale and feeble, and he's not connected to Elliot. And for anybody who's not seen E.T., this alien forms a bond with this young boy, and it sort of becomes our portal to understanding this other civilization. But I feel like this is all apropos to suddenly where we are. And we have all been in pretty much abject isolation, but we feel connected through Zoom and these 3D platforms. So what is the... I'll let you both respond to that.
Do you mind if I make a comment about your work, David? Because I have been thinking about it recently, and I also had the pleasure of experiencing it at Moore, which was so exciting, because I didn't realize, it was so cool. What that kind of resonates for me now is this: what you're doing is you propagate yourself, and you almost then don't know which one of you is which and where you are. Which I think is, again, like I sense that in this time, that we are having to multiply ourselves into all these different versions. I think especially, well, I'm sure in many other professions it's the same, but with teaching, where you're having to put your coursework in so many different versions for your students, and you kind of forget where you're located at this particular time, and it almost doesn't matter anymore because you've created all these different versions of yourself, all these different platforms, which I think your work is kind of showing us that as like the zeitgeist for it.
Right. It's interesting because I feel like the technology affords this multiplication of the self, right? As you say, whether it's on Zoom or, you're making a video of a lecture, or, you're having another email conversation while at the same time you're doing something else. I think part of me, I worry a little bit about these traces. First off, it's hard to separate the sort of socioeconomic underpinnings of all of this technology, right? Like the data that's being mined by all of our activities through all of these technologies. And I think part of the work that I was doing was very much about considering that data and how, we prior to the technologies tracking this information, it wasn't considered valuable in the sense we couldn't monetize it in the way that we can now. And now we have these technologies that we're using on a day-to-day basis. I upload a lecture to YouTube, and of course the algorithms are able to produce a transcript of that information, and who knows what that data is being used for. And it's tracking, even if it's an unlisted video, it's tracking traffic. And I put on a VR headset, and if I'm using an Oculus headset, I'm sending all that information to Facebook. And so, I worry about, we talk about the multiplication of self, but it's also like literally that self is being mined and monetized. And then, to what end, right? And ultimately we've seen the sort of, the way that plays out in the political sphere, especially in the United States with the 2016 elections, and who knows, this past election, I'm sure it was playing a role, and definitely during the COVID pandemic, that how information is traveling around, who it's being targeted to, is being influenced by this data that we're sending. So there's a real concern there. I think that, with your work, actually, Marilyn, I feel like the connection, it's like you turn it the other way, in the sense of like, instead of it being about sending it out, it's like bringing it back in, right? And it's literally the insides. It's literally the insides, right? It's literally imaging the insides, and in that sense, I think that's another aspect of information that is always happening, right? Like our internal systems are always happening. And even on an unconscious level, where or subconscious level, we're constantly monitoring our body's monitoring itself. And these processes, I feel like, are really, really important into understanding who our sense of self, right? Just like we understand our sense of self through these technologies we interact with. I think like, our sense of like just being hungry and how that it can affect my mood, and then how my mood affects how I think, and how I think will affect my behavior towards other people, and how I interpret things that I see and feel, right? And I think, so, your work, I think, was really powerful when I experienced it at FIVARS, because it did make me think about those internal processes that we don't normally pay attention to, but are so incredibly grounding and influential in who we are and how we encounter the world.
Yeah.
I also think about that notion of like seeing yourself exposed in that way, but also like we so often just have a mirror to rely on, or photographs of ourselves, and you kind of look at yourself and go, oh, is that what I look like? Sometimes it's more flattering, a photograph can be framed just so with this light or this video frame, but then you look at yourself in a mirror and you're like, God, I put on 20 pounds and I look old, and I think the mind really curves our self-perception. Sometimes we look more awful than we want to. We're sort of dysmorphic and self-loathing, and then other times we might say, I really love my grays, and I really love this little pooch I've got, and whatever it is, it's extremely subjective how we regard ourselves. But then to have yourself scanned and in 3D and floating in space in front of you is kind of much more objective. And I think that there's this, I always find there's a kindness. Like if I see, if I'm in the hospital and I see myself stitched up, or I feel that kind of extreme fragility at that moment, my whole body suddenly seems so much more precious, and all of those other things become more irrelevant. And it's just that I have this thing that I have, and that relationship to self, I think, is a moving dot, on a graph. And I with Marilyn's piece, I really, and also with yours, David, in David's piece, you're sort of seeing the intricacies of your own movement, your idiosyncratic head movements and body movements. And in Marilyn's piece, there's kind of this like abject, wow, is that me? Is this the way, I can approach myself, but I can also see the physicality of this embodiment. And you want to reach out and kind of touch it and say, that's not what my knee looks like. That's not what my foot looks like. And what I talked about in our panel was kind of this ability for this sort of media to give us the scaffolding, and I've said this a few times, but to kind of step away from, the safe platform and kind of break apart the calcification of our notion of the self and of what we are in that.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that a lot, also about how much data we give away. And that was also part of the project, is to think about sort of data as in the given what we give, and that it is sort of located in a time and space. And that's what's so exciting about virtual reality, is that it can be explored as a spatial, almost like a sculptural space. But that data is located in its kind of original context, in a way that it still occupies the physical space that the original data occupied. And so that was something that I was very interested to explore. It's interesting what you say, like I'm now actually reworking that data for a new piece, and I just actually have it, I'm just working on it now, which is to insert all the social media and other data that I generate into the body. And so I'm kind of like, I'm putting all my Facebook data into the fat, I'm putting all my Google data into the muscle, I'm putting all my Mac terminal data into the bones, and then I'm going to try and recreate a new piece from that. But it's like, what is it that we are now? What is the self? I think throughout humanity, we're always asking that question. But now, as we're becoming more and more datafied, we just like almost we don't exist if we don't exist in a way for others unless we go through this we mediated through technology. And so what is the self? Well, how is it datafied? What is it? How are we responsible for it? How do we understand it? And in the same way, that's the same with the body. How do we understand our bodies? How do we come to terms with them? How do we care for them or not? As you say, there are times when we're very critical to our own image, and then there are times when we're kinder. But do we do the same with our data? Because that's what we are now in this reality.
And in the Dyscorpia project, can you mention any sort of works or writings or pieces in that you also want to bring up in this context?
Well, there was the essay that you wrote. Which
Full disclosure, I was invited to contribute an article to the book. Yes.
Yeah. So we created the exhibition, and then we also created a catalogue which kind of contextualized the work. And I think what was really interesting in your essay was thinking about the spatial aspect of virtual reality and what it does to cognition and to our sense of being, which I thought was a very great contribution. I don't know if you want to expand more, Keram.
Well, I think now that you're reminding me, what I was kind of concerned with was developing a grammar in the Z-axis, because we have architects and we have dancers and we have theater directors and people and light, cinematographers and people who understand space. They have a relationship to space and how it has this kind of psychogeographic impact on us. But I don't think that the culture at large is really familiar with. I mean, we have a sense of location and time and place, but there's something about expressing oneself in space that I think is maybe going to become more prevalent. And as our media becomes spatialized, as these virtual event spaces, you have to figure out how, what kind of locomotion are you comfortable with? In fact, there's a part of my chapter where I just talk about evolutionarily how we evolved to think, well, if my mind is moving and I feel these sort of occipital effects and vestibular effects, but my body is not, then that means I might be sick and I should probably purge because I might be poisoned or something. And yet we might become evolutionarily adapted. But how long will it take, right? It would take tens of thousands of years, maybe thousands of years, maybe hundreds, I don't know. So how do we start to become more inclined, capable, eloquent in traversing virtualized dimensional spaces? And I'll give you just one example of what that means is like a lot of these conferences that are now pivoting online or educational programs, they tend to build rooms when they go into these spaces. Like, oh, here's a room and it has a ceiling and this is the capacity, because we're so used to that sort of construct to define a space, right? But of course we don't have to use any of those constructs. We don't need a ceiling or walls or anything. And yet we still want to partition ourselves in terms of the community and say like, this is here and that is there. And do we really have the grammar to understand other processes for that? You might be living in a multi-dimensional spot in the universe right now. There might be 50 million things happening right where you stand. Do we even know what that even means? Is it in time? Is it in space? Is it in color and texture and molecule arrangement? So this gives us the opportunity to consider those things and to have those dualities and multi-dimensionalities occurring in the same place at the same time. But I'm not going to eat up all the bandwidth. I just wanted to tell you that that's what my chapter was about, and that this gives us an opportunity to put on our space helmet. That was the sort of the title of it, and go spelunking, right, into these ideas of multiple things inhabiting the same space simultaneously in time and dimension.
Well, in a sense, I think that's what happens as soon as you put on a VR headset, right? I mean, in the setup that we had at FIVARS, it was really important for me to have these sort of monitors that give you these sort of windows into this virtual space for people who don't have the headset on. And I love this idea that, you know, you sit and you watch someone who is going through the work with the headset on, and you can imagine this sort of virtual space that's overlaid like a palimpsest, you know, on top of the physical world. And I think that's one of the sort of really exciting things about VR in terms of public exhibition of VR is activating that imaginative sense of having spaces layered on top of one another, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, we do this all the time, right? You can go walk through the city and you can maybe imagine, oh, I remember when I was standing on this street corner and I was, you know, had my first kiss on this street corner. And you're brought right back to that's time and space, and it's sort of laid on top of, you know, your current physical surroundings. Or you go back to your childhood home or town, and you see a store that used to be a bakery, but now it's something else, and you can kind of imagine the previous iterations of those spaces layered on top. You know, VR lets us kind of explore those ideas in a sort of more manifest way, and also in a way that we can experience, as I said before, through our bodies in space, right? We can understand it not just looking at it on a photograph or seeing it on a screen, but moving through it with our bodies and fully understanding it in that way.
Yeah, there's that sort of these parallel consciousnesses that conscious eye that VR allows us to have access to for, like, so one of the reasons why I made that sculptural installation was to kind of make you give that kind of frisson when you take the VR headset up. I think that moment when you put the headset on and you go into a different conscious space, and then when you take it off again, there's like, every time I kind of think, well, I'm still here, still in this space. And so like making those sculptures were like, I'm back into reality, but there's something that was in that virtual space that's physical too, but just in a slightly different form. Was kind of something I wanted to point to with making the sculptures. And I think that's why it's so great to have virtual reality experiences in physical spaces, as you say, as part of installations, to give that. Like, if I think back at your piece at FIVARS, I remember the VR, but I also remember the room, and it was kind of walled off, wasn't it? I kind of remember the physical space that I went through, the real space. But I don't remember it so much in VR. I remember the figures, but the physical spaces was the real one that I can kind of remember more.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, right? You know, I'm currently working on a piece where I want to try to find a way to bring the outside into the headset in real time, even in a sort of abstract way. So that people moving, so that there's not only that you get around the sort of line up to experience this VR headset kind of thing that happens in a public exhibition of VR, but also really exploring the idea of having someone who has a sort of I like this idea of consciousness that you mentioned, this idea of like a different consciousness, but within the same physical realm. And so there's a way to bring in people who are in the space with you who don't have the headset on into that space, and they have a representation within that space. And then the people outside of the headset, of course, they can see the person with the headset on, but also can experience the physical world. So trying to find a way of blending the realities in a sense, but offering these sort of two different views of the same
and of course we see this
itself.
Everywhere with, you know, Beat Saber videos where
Yes.
people it's just completely natural to them, you know. I mean, I watch these Beat Saber videos where people are just hacking polygons at a rate that my brain doesn't even move. and you're seeing them both in their virtual space and in the one. And what it means to me is, the question, like, what do we permit ourselves to do and become as soon as we are on the other side of that virtual wall, over that garden wall? Does our moral compass change? Does our attitude and persona change? How do we embody both of those spaces at the same time, morally even? Like, am I able to be an awful, crime lord, usurper of the land when I go into virtual space and come back and be a sweetheart? And Steve Mann was somebody who did a lot of pioneering work in this regard, and we'll discuss that a little bit in the video that we're going to cut to. But he always had a AR glass over his one eye. I mean, for years he never took it off. It was on his face for like 2 decades, and he was constantly with you, but also staring into this information feed. I have no idea what he was looking at, but he understood what it meant to be in both places at once. And Galit Ariel always talks about the fact that you're sharing public and private space at the same time when you're using augmented reality. And I just think that that question of like, what moral compass do I subscribe to between these two worlds? And not just morality, but what permissions do I afford myself in each of these worlds, and can we hold the tension between those? Is there a tension? Are we the same person regardless of what form we take and what world we're inside of? How much is transportable across that threshold?
That's interesting. It makes me think also one of the experiences of having the deep connection as part of an exhibition. So when you have virtual reality kind of artworks like that are in a real space, you have to be there to make sure that no one falls over. So I was able to kind of watch a lot of people in the same way that you were, David. And I had many visitors where you had couples that had been together for years and years, and that one of them put the headset on, and I could see from the other person that they were seeing their partner move in a way they had never seen them move before. And they were completely like, they thought it was great, obviously, but it was just really fascinating that again and again and again, there was a change in their whole comportment and what they dared to do or not do that was completely new when they had the headset on. And I imagine, David, you've probably seen that too, that people were doing things, and they are in public, and they will do things when they've got their headset on that is complete, that they lose some of their inhibitions, or I don't know if that's even the right word.
Yeah.
But something different happens.
I did have one woman who went through my work, and she said afterwards she kind of just walked around very slowly, very tentatively for about, the work was about 8 minutes or so if you did the whole piece. And afterwards she said, I thought she was going to take it off and go, this was horrible. She's like, I loved it. And I was like, oh, great, thanks. And she's like, but I want to do it at home by myself, because she felt really, you mentioned being watched, right? Like she felt like she was being watched, and she didn't like the fact that she couldn't see who was looking at her, right? Because when you have the headset on, you're aware that you're in a public space, but she was hyper aware of the fact that she was being watched. And so she didn't feel comfortable enough to sort of do what she would normally do in the comfort of her own home. And I thought that was really, really, really interesting, just to see how immediately she's holding this tension, right? And it's I mean, the reality of these technologies that I mentioned earlier, and the part of the point of this piece itself is the way that VR works is that it watches you all the time. It's following your headset, your head movements, the direction that you're moving, and if you're holding hand controllers, it's got all this positional information. That is the information we're using to animate the avatars of yourself in time. And so it's interesting that, we're okay putting on the headset and being watched by, let's say, Facebook, right? If you buy a Quest 2 and, we're okay sending this information, but we're not okay if, some stranger gets to see you move around in public.
That's a huge point, David, because that abstraction, that we are discussing is the problem. That is what can be exploited. Once Facebook becomes the platform of your life, and I mean, I've gone into really heated debates with people who I say, you should not be here. I'm standing in the middle of the street going, you should not be here. Do not trust this place. I mean, Facebook street. And they say, no, it's fine. If you have the right friends and you follow the right feeds, then you'll just see the stuff that you like. And I use this place to communicate with my family. And I'm like, but why do you need this place to do that thing? Somebody owns this platform and you're being observed, and you've normalized it to the degree where it just becomes the background. And you're unaware of the fact that you're sitting in a petri dish with the lights focused right on you, being dissected by the second, and every movement that you make is being dissected. And I think that the work that you both are doing, this way of creating that sort of self-consciousness and that separation and the embodiment of it, is a reminder. And this is the work that Steve Mann was doing. It's a reminder that you are inside of that petri dish, that you are being sort of inculcated by these sort of mechanisms that are designed to process you like so much chicken in a factory. And we have to we restore that self-awareness and that sense of sovereignty among ourselves.
Well, and let's not kid ourselves. I mean, this information is you, right? I mean, Marilyn, you mentioned this earlier. It is you. Your data is you, right? Like, someone might say, oh, well, if you have the data of someone moving around in a VR piece, playing Beat Saber or whatever, how can you tell if that's person A or person B? But you can tell. There was a research paper out of Stanford, I think it was, about a month ago, saying they could identify within a 95% accuracy a person from their movement in VR.
Yeah. And that's
just
also
based on
credit to Phil Rosedale. He also did a talk about that, the guy that created Second Life and High Fidelity.
Yeah. So, I mean, this information is, and, they've been doing, for example, with eye tracking, they've been using eye tracking in advertising studies to track, what people are looking at when they watch a television commercial or look at an advertisement, a print ad. They've been using that technology forever. So, this information is extremely valuable. It has monetary value, and it is identifiable. So, I think the concern is very real, especially when you start combining it with all the other information about you that there is out there. Who you hang out with, what you like, what restaurants you eat at, or what things you buy. And, I think that it's a little worrisome because ultimately we get reduced to this information, right? We get reduced to the things we buy and
we get controlled by it. I mean, we see that, like with the social credit system, is that the government can control it and either give privileges or take away privileges depending on your digital being as well. And that's the future, that the more we give away, the more it can be used against us for harm or for control. And of course, it's those who are most vulnerable who will be most controlled and most harmed by it. We really need to work hard to understand what we are and what we can take responsibility for and how we can control it. Because that's the future, there's no doubt.
Yeah.
We see that. Yeah.
I'll close this session just by pointing out that yesterday a case was brought against Facebook, the Panopticon, by 48 states in the U.S. and basically suing them for anti-competitive practices and for running essentially a monopoly by buying any sort of competitors, including Instagram and WhatsApp. And it's not just the fact that they do control all the communication pipes that are, not all of them, but the majority of them that are being used, but that they use grossly anti-competitive practices to prevent anybody else from breaking that apart. So just as a historic sort of footnote, that's happening in the same 24-hour block as the conversation that we're having right now, and we'll see what that implication is. The reasons for people doing it, for these various states and the government doing this, are manifold. You know, I'm always a bit suspect of the motivations for these sorts of things, but at the same time, there was nobody online who was actually mad about this. Everybody said, yeah, tear it all down, tear it apart. So in a way, the populace is aware of the fact that it's in a soma and wants to wake up from it. There's a lot of sort of moving dark circles in this whole sort of game, but
it's already so complex because we're so implicated and trapped in it. Can't break it down.
Yeah, but it's also not sustainable, and the kind of the human spirit, whatever that means, really can only take it for so long. And you add a pandemic and isolation to that on top of that, and it just sort of it starts to reject it after a while. It's like we can't. Either you become completely subsumed by it and you have no remembrance of what it was like not to be that way, or you just can't take it anymore.
I think that we really need to address the ethics of all this. Like we just need to, as a humanity, we need to think about. It's not necessarily all bad. I see really great things with all this connectivity,
yes.
And but I think it's great that so many states are coming together. We see it in Europe too. I mean, we are calling for an ethical consideration of what all this data is and how to move forward. And
it eventually will outpace us. And we have to remember what we are in that, right? Once the allure, that inevitable progression of the tech, the AI, the machine learning, the cloud, the whole swarm of it outpaces us and we lose control, we have to remember what is the human in this and what is human. And I mean, we could open up another 3-hour conversation on that front. David, closing thoughts?
Well, just that I think you mentioned this earlier, is that I think, and this is the role, I think for me at least, my belief is that this is the role that artists play, right? Is to show us other possibilities, right? That this data that we're giving, that we have, that we provide, right? That is us, and that we have the ability through these technologies to collect, isn't in it of itself, all bad, right? And what artists can do is show the possibilities of how we can learn from this and imagine different ways of living and being. And I think that's the role that artists play, right? And why it's really important, at least for me, and I'm sure for Marilyn too. I don't want to speak for you, but I get the sense that you're very much of the same opinion. Having gone through your work is like dealing with this technology, collaborating with it in a sense. I got from me is it shows us another way of how we can think about these processes and another way of living that isn't about just trying to sell us a bunch of stuff on Amazon.
Who also contributed $10 billion to climate change research and everything else. I mean, there's a lot of positive gains and like I said, we're going to become subsumed by, physicists are talking about how information is not what we think it is. It's an entirely different sort of energy in the universe than we give it credit for. Anyways, we'll continue this conversation at the next FIVARS. And it's been my real pleasure to have you both here. I feel like the luckiest person at the tea party. And be safe out there, and thank you for your work.